"You're not allowed in, company policy." The words rang out like a firecracker in a silent church. It was 102 degrees out, the pool was nearly empty, and yet my sister Lena, soaked in sweat and hope, sat at the gate in her wheelchair while a woman in oversized sunglasses and too much sunscreen blocked her path with arms crossed like she was guarding Fort Knox. I was 2 steps behind Lena with a towel in one hand and sunscreen in the other, watching this scene unfold like a bad sitcom with no punchline. The gate clanked behind us as Karen Witherspoon, the self-appointed HOA pool enforcer, glanced down at Lena's chair like it was a ticking time bomb instead of a mobility aid. She sniffed once and said, "Wheels aren't permitted on the deck. It's a safety risk." My mind snapped. Not because she said it, but because she meant it. My sister, who had fought through rehab after a drunk driver totaled her car and spined 2 years ago, was being denied entry to a public pool funded by the very HOA fees she'd paid on time every month. And she was being denied access not because of who she was, but what she sat in. That's when I decided this HOA had just declared war. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know I spent my days in a federal robe slamming gavels on people who thought discrimination was a hobby. They didn't know that Lena wasn't just my sister. She was the only reason I survived law school. And they definitely didn't know that I didn't believe in mercy when it came to civil rights violations. But they were about to find out. 3 hours earlier, the day had started like any normal Saturday. Lena had invited me over to her new place in Crestwood Pines, a quiet, pre-planned community with suspiciously perfect hedges and aggressively cheerful mailboxes. She'd just bought a townhouse here 6 months ago, her first property since the accident. After everything she'd endured, multiple surgeries, learning how to drive again with hand controls, navigating job interviews with barely disguised pity from hiring managers, this house was her fortress. She'd saved every penny from her freelance graphic design gigs and poured them into this place. "It even has a pool," she had texted me the night she moved in. "Want to be the first splash of the summer?" We packed sandwiches, loaded the cooler with iced tea and sodas, and rolled over to the community pool with music playing and the world feeling just a little less cruel than usual. That feeling lasted until we reached the pool gate. That's where Karen stood, like some sunscreen-slathered Cerberus. She looked us up and down with an expression that suggested we'd just parked a garbage truck on her front lawn. Lena tried to keep it cool, offering a polite smile and flashing her resident badge. Karen didn't blink. "Chairs aren't allowed on the deck," she said again, this time slower, like Lena was hard of hearing instead of being hard of walking. I stepped forward. "She's not a chair. She's a human being in one." Karen's lip twitched like she'd tasted a lemon. "It's not personal. It's policy." That word again. Policy. The favorite shield of every petty tyrant who's ever had just enough power to ruin someone's day. I asked to see the policy. She pointed to a laminated sign on the fence, which listed rules like, no running, no glass bottles, and no unapproved flotation devices. There was no mention of wheelchairs. Lena tried again. "I'm not going in the pool. Just want to be near the edge, dip my feet, maybe read." Karen tilted her head, mock sympathetic. "The pool deck's not designed for chairs. The concrete gets hot. You might get hurt and sue us." I could practically hear the lawsuit gears grinding in her head. Lena's face dropped. She looked at me, not with defeat, but with that worn-down tiredness that comes from fighting too many small battles. That's when I knew it wasn't just about this one moment. It was about all the moments like it. The subtle humiliations, the invisible walls, the way the world quietly agrees to make spaces for everyone, except the people who need them most. I took a breath. Years of courtroom training kicked in. Calm voice, measured tone. "My name is Maxine Carter. This is my sister Lena Carter. She's a paying homeowner here. She is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And unless there is a specific, lawful, written policy barring ADA-compliant mobility devices from this facility, you are violating federal law by denying her access." Karen blinked. Once. Twice. I'll have to call the board, she muttered, already fumbling for her walkie-talkie. Please do, I said. In fact, call them all. I'll be calling someone, too. I pulled out my phone and took a slow, sweeping video of the sign, the gate, Karen's sunburned expression, and Lena sitting patiently, waiting for dignity like it was something you needed permission for. We left quietly. I pushed Lena back down the path toward her townhouse while she stayed silent, clutching the towel on her lap like it was holding her together. A few other residents had seen the exchange. One woman with a stroller mouthed, "I'm so sorry," as we passed. A teenage boy gave us a thumbs up. Another older man muttered, "Karen's been pulling that crap for years." It all clicked into place. This wasn't just a one-off. This was a pattern. Karen was the enforcer of a broken system, one that thought it could tiptoe around the law and hide behind laminated rules and HOA jargon. They thought they were safe in their little suburban kingdom. But they'd just slammed the gate shut on the wrong person's family. Back at Lena's, I made her a glass of lemonade while she sat staring at the pool brochure she'd been so excited about when she moved in. "I should have known," she said quietly. "It always happens." I sat across from her. "Not this time," I said. "This time, they're getting the full Maxine Carter treatment." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Because when I promised someone justice, I didn't rest until I'd delivered it with interest. I took out my notepad, opened my laptop, and pulled up the HOA bylaws. I wasn't just going to make this right for Lena. I was going to make sure no one else ever had to ask permission to belong in their own neighborhood. Let the board brace themselves. They thought they ran a pool. They had no idea they were about to dive headfirst into a federal investigation. By Sunday morning, the HOA board was already in full scramble mode, but they didn't know it yet. Behind closed doors, they were sipping weak coffee from disposable cups and treating the incident at the pool like it was a mild PR hiccup. Karen, of course, took center stage at the emergency meeting, standing in front of a whiteboard like she was hosting a seminar on how to look concerned while doing absolutely nothing. "I did what I was trained to do," she insisted, her voice a mix of martyrdom and indignation. "We have safety standards for a reason. If we let one person bring a wheelchair on the pool deck, what's next? Scooters? Golf carts? Drones?" A few board members chuckled, clearly mistaking her ridiculous comparison for a joke. Todd Renfield, the HOA president and a man who had peaked in life during a high school debate tournament he never stopped bragging about, nodded with performative solemnity. "We can't let this one situation set a dangerous precedent. We're not discriminating. We're protecting the amenities." He said the last word like he was safeguarding ancient treasure, not a cement rectangle filled with chlorinated water. Their so-called concerns didn't surprise me. I'd already spent the night going through the HOA's bylaws, which looked like they'd been drafted during the Cold War. Among their outdated gems were rules banning motorized equipment near water sources and a section about banning prolonged sitting on pool furniture during peak hours. That rule, laughably vague and utterly unenforceable, had probably never been cited, until someone in a wheelchair needed a spot in the shade. It wasn't just archaic. It was intentionally ambiguous, the perfect tool for selective enforcement. And that's exactly what was happening here. Lena, meanwhile, was doing her best to pretend it hadn't gotten to her. She buried herself in design work, her eyes fixed on a tablet screen as she reworked a client's wedding invitation for the 5th time. But I knew her. I knew when she was pretending to be fine, just like I knew how much she hated being seen as a cause instead of a person. "You don't have to go to war over this," she told me that afternoon. I handed her a copy of the ADA compliance guide. "I'm not going to war," I said. "I'm enforcing the peace they violated." She looked away, but not before I caught the flicker of a smile she tried to hide behind her coffee mug. It didn't take long before the stories started trickling in. Once people caught wind of what happened at the pool, the neighborhood grapevine kicked into overdrive. An elderly man named Frank, who walked with a cane and had been scolded by Karen last year for sitting too close to the water's edge, left a handwritten letter in Lena's mailbox. I was told I was a trip hazard. At my own pool. You're not alone, kiddo. Then there was the young mom who messaged me through the community app, saying her autistic son had been yelled at for using a flotation vest that wasn't on the approved list. A teenager with a prosthetic leg was told to stay in the shallow end last summer. None of these incidents had made it to formal complaint. People didn't want to deal with the headache. Until now. I compiled everything into a growing dossier: names, dates, descriptions, photo evidence. It became clear that Karen and her board buddies had built a quiet culture of exclusion. No slurs, no outright bans, just 1,000 tiny inconveniences, microaggressions masked as policy enforcement. The HOA had mastered plausible deniability. But under federal law, intention didn't matter nearly as much as impact. And impact? Oh, we had that in spades. Things got more interesting when I requested the full HOA rulebook. What they gave me was a PDF that had clearly been scanned from a faded print copy, complete with coffee stains and pen marks. I flipped through the document like I was deciphering a historical artifact. One page had a section highlighted with a note that said, "Ask board about language here." That section? The one about wheeled devices. They hadn't even finished editing it, and they were already using it to keep Lena out of the pool. It was sloppy. It was amateur. And it was going to get them sued. Of course, no story is complete without a ridiculous villain trying to escalate the situation. Enter Chad Bracknell, Karen's cousin and self-proclaimed legal expert, who ran a strip mall law office sandwiched between a vape shop and a failing gym. Chad, who wore suits 3 sizes too tight and spoke with the confidence of a man who thought watching reruns of Law and Order made him an attorney, decided to insert himself into the situation. He delivered a cease and desist letter to Lena's doorstep, claiming her accusations were defamatory and threatening further action if she continued to incite hostility toward community leadership. I read the letter twice. Then I laughed for a full minute. It wasn't just baseless. It was poorly written, with typos and vague legal threats that made no sense. Allegedly defamatory language of any kind will not be tolerated, it read. As if Lena's experience was a rumor and not something captured on video by at least 3 witnesses. I wrote a response that was as cold as it was devastating. 16 pages, double-spaced, with references to precedent, constitutional protections, and ADA violations. I even threw in a section on abuse of power under the Fair Housing Act. I didn't just shut Chad down. I buried him in enough legal language to make his head spin. Lena read it and said, "You scare me sometimes." I grinned. Good. While Karen and the board were trying to figure out how to sweep everything under the nearest rug, I was preparing a storm. I reached out to a local disability rights organization and gave them a full breakdown. They were thrilled. This case was a textbook example of ADA noncompliance, and they'd been looking for a case to bring attention to community-level discrimination. I had witnesses, documents, a compelling victim, and the kind of legal firepower most people only dreamed of. And I was just getting started. The cherry on top? I found out through a casual Google search that the HOA had accepted federal grant money for its recent pool renovation. That meant they were under even stricter accessibility requirements than normal. Requirements they had failed to meet in nearly every measurable way. They hadn't just hurt Lena. They had broken federal funding rules. Now we weren't just talking about a lawsuit. We were talking about potential investigations, audits, and penalties. Todd and the board had no idea what was coming. They still thought this was a neighborly dispute, a minor misunderstanding that could be handled with a polite memo or a public apology. But they hadn't read the fine print. They didn't know they'd triggered the full wrath of a federal judge with an axe to grind and a sister to defend. Every smug email, every outdated rule, every sideways comment, they had all added up. And when I was finished, there wouldn't just be justice. There would be consequences. By Monday morning, the neighborhood was no longer quiet. The story had leaked like a cracked pipe. A bystander's video of Lena being denied access at the pool had made it onto a local Facebook group Sunday evening, and from there it spread like wildfire. By sunrise, local news vans were idling just outside the gated entrance of Crestwood Pines, their antennas pointed skyward like curious metal giraffes sniffing scandal. The headline practically wrote itself. Disabled woman denied pool access by HOA, sister is a federal judge. And just like that, the HOA had gone from being a petty neighborhood committee to a regional punchline. Karen tried to play it cool. She strutted into the pool office wearing oversized sunglasses and a tracksuit 2 decades out of fashion, clearly hoping to pass herself off as the victim of a witch hunt. The reporter from Channel 6 News wasn't buying it. They asked her a direct question: why was a disabled homeowner denied access to a pool she pays for? Karen smiled stiffly and said, "We follow safety protocol. Wheelchairs can cause damage to the pool deck. Also, it's about fairness. Other residents don't get to bring their furniture to the pool either." The silence that followed was louder than anything she could have said. When the segment aired later that evening, the station actually included a slow zoom on Karen's face as she fumbled her answer, followed by a legal expert explaining that the ADA supersedes all HOA policies and that wheelchairs are not furniture. I didn't have time to celebrate that little victory. I was too busy filing the federal injunction against the HOA. I brought out every tool in my arsenal. The complaint was thorough, detailed, and brutal. I cited specific instances of ADA violations, created a timeline of discriminatory enforcement, and included testimony from half a dozen residents who had been harassed or excluded under the guise of policy. I named Karen personally, along with Todd and the other board members. I requested immediate injunctive relief, monetary damages, a full review of HOA policies, and a federal compliance audit. The filing alone caused panic. By noon, Chad Bracknell had emailed me with a subject line that read, "Urgent, possible resolution?" I didn't reply. Not yet. The HOA called an emergency board meeting that evening, closed to the public. But several residents stood outside the clubhouse and live-tweeted the muffled yelling inside. Apparently, Karen had tried to resign and then unresign in the same breath. Todd was blaming her for going off script, and Karen was insisting that the board told her to be firm. At one point someone shouted, "This is exactly why we didn't let you handle the Halloween potluck." Chaos. Delicious, imploding chaos. Meanwhile, Lena tried to keep her head down. She didn't like the attention, didn't want to be on the news, didn't want to become a symbol. But she also couldn't deny the impact. Neighbors were dropping off flowers and cards. One teenager she'd never met before stopped her on the sidewalk and said, "My little brother's in a wheelchair. Thanks for standing up." Lena didn't cry, but I knew she wanted to. It wasn't about the pool anymore. It was about dignity. About being seen. About being treated like you belong somewhere without having to fight for it every time. While the HOA tried to regroup, I moved to the next phase, discovery. I filed formal requests for all internal communications related to pool policies, resident complaints, and any correspondence involving Lena's name or the incident. It took less than a week for the bombshells to arrive. Their internal emails were a goldmine of arrogance and incompetence. In one thread, Karen joked about installing a speed bump at the pool gate to slow down the motorized folk. In another, Todd referred to Lena as the pool Roomba. They had shared memes, some tasteless, some outright offensive. One board member had even emailed a YouTube clip titled, "Top 10 People Who Shouldn't Swim," with the subject line, "Summer Goals." It was stomach-turning. But it was also exactly what I needed. The moment I filed those messages as evidence, everything changed. The HOA tried to settle, offering a private apology and a vague promise to review their accessibility practices. I declined. Then they doubled their offer. Again I declined. I wasn't interested in hush money. I wanted structural change. I wanted policy overhaul. I wanted Karen's resignation in writing and Todd's HOA reign permanently dismantled. And most of all, I wanted a public record, a court ruling that would be searchable, referenceable, and permanent. At this point, the story had reached national news. A segment ran on a major network with the headline, "Wheelchair Ban Sparks Federal Lawsuit in Suburban Community." They showed a clip of Lena wheeling down the sidewalk, followed by a shot of me stepping out of the courthouse with a file under my arm like I was walking into a courtroom drama. Suddenly, our inboxes were flooded. Advocacy groups, journalists, attorneys, law students. Some wanted to help. Some wanted quotes. One man from Seattle emailed Lena to say he was suing his own HOA for a similar incident and thanked her for going public. Lena was overwhelmed, but she also started to smile again. For the first time, she wasn't just a victim. She was a catalyst. But the real twist came when we received an anonymous package. It was a manila envelope stuffed with printed emails, board meeting notes, and handwritten complaints that had never been filed. A sticky note attached read, "I've been on the board for years. I'm done being quiet." It was signed only with an initial. Among the contents was a memo dated 2 months before the pool incident. In it, Karen had proposed adding language to the pool rules that would strongly discourage large, wheeled devices from entering the area. It had been rejected for sounding too aggressive. But Karen had gone ahead and enforced it anyway. Proof of premeditated discrimination. I filed that document with the court the same day. With all that momentum, I scheduled the court date. The HOA tried one last time to settle, this time with an NDA and a check big enough to buy Lena a second home. We turned it down. Some things aren't for sale. By now, Lena had her own attorney, one of my former students, eager and fierce, and together we prepared for the main event. We weren't just going to win. We were going to make history, one pool tile at a time. Because they didn't just underestimate the law. They underestimated the sister who wielded it like a sword. As the court date loomed, the HOA flailed like a fish out of water, desperate to patch its sinking reputation. They called an emergency community meeting to try and get ahead of the narrative. Karen, freshly unresigned, stood in front of a banner that read "Community First" in Comic Sans, which should have been the first red flag. She held a microphone with both hands like it might jump out of her grip and betray her. The room was packed, mostly with angry residents who were tired of being embarrassed by the people they paid to manage their neighborhood. Karen started with a shaky voice, claiming she deeply regretted any confusion, and that she had never intended to make anyone feel unwelcome. Confusion? It wasn't confusion. It was recorded, documented, and broadcast. The only confusion was hers, thinking she could gaslight an entire community into forgetting what they'd seen with their own eyes. Then came the performance. Karen teared up halfway through her speech, complete with strategically dabbed tissues and sniffles. She blamed her poor judgment on a stressful week, allergies, and not enough staff training. She said the pool deck rules were outdated and that she was just doing what she thought was best. At one point, she even said she was a huge ally of the differently abled. The room went quiet after that. Someone near the back coughed, loudly and pointedly. The residents weren't buying it. Not anymore. Too many people had been brushed aside, written off, or embarrassed under her leadership. And now that Lena's story had gone public, the mask was off. The HOA board tried to build on the sympathy play by suggesting a temporary compromise they were calling chair hours. They proposed designated pool times for residents who used mobility devices, Wednesdays and Fridays, 6 to 6:30 a.m. 30-minute, twice a week. Before sunrise, the room exploded. A man in a Hawaiian shirt stood up and shouted, "Are you serious? You think that's equality?" Another woman yelled, "That's segregation." And she was right. It was an insult masquerading as inclusion. Karen tried to defend it, saying it was a starting point, but the crowd wasn't having it. Someone actually started chanting, "Karen must go," and within minutes, the meeting disintegrated into shouting and finger-pointing. But just as the board thought it couldn't get worse, it did. A local disability rights organization called Access now held a press conference outside the HOA office. They came with banners, speakers, and a guest of honor no one expected, Olympic gold medalist and paraplegic swimmer Maya Del Rio. She rolled up to the microphone with grace and fury. "I've competed in world-class pools across 5 continents," she said. "And never, have I been told my chair makes me a liability." Her speech went viral before she even finished it. By the time Karen and the board came out to respond, they were drowned in boos and reporters. Then came the deepfake scandal. In a desperate attempt to rebuild her image, Karen had posted a slick video apology online. It was polished, tearful, and suspiciously eloquent. It only took a few hours for the internet to figure out the video had been created using an AI script generator. The entire thing, from the facial expressions to the voice modulation, was synthetic. Karen had literally faked her feelings. The backlash was immediate. The comments section became a war zone. Residents who had defended her earlier deleted their posts. Even the HOA's social media page disabled comments, which only made things worse. And then, because fate has a sense of humor, security footage from the day of the incident leaked to the public. It showed Karen blocking Lena at the gate, just like the bystander video, but this one had audio. Loud and clear, Karen could be heard saying, "Letting her in opens the floodgates. Then we'll have every sad story rolling in for a pity swim." The internet exploded. Memes were made. News outlets ran the quote across tickers. It was indefensible. Karen's apology tour came to a screeching halt. In retaliation, Karen tried to sue me. Not Lena, me. She filed a lawsuit claiming emotional distress, defamation, and professional sabotage. She even claimed I had weaponized my legal position to destroy her livelihood. The case didn't last long. It was dismissed by a judge who read the motion and said, "I'm not sure whether to laugh or fine you." Karen's lawyer tried to argue that my filing of the ADA lawsuit was personal. The judge replied, "Federal judges don't need to be personal to know the law. That's kind of the whole point." The courtroom actually chuckled. I didn't even speak during the hearing. I didn't have to. With Karen out of moves and the HOA spiraling, Todd made one last, desperate attempt to save face. He tried to pivot the narrative by claiming that the HOA board was actually the victim of a targeted smear campaign, a media circus, and a hostile resident takeover. He held a press conference outside his house flanked by 2 board members and a man holding an umbrella over his head like he was royalty. Todd rambled about unity, community values, and how difficult it is to serve thankless residents. He tried to position himself as a beleaguered hero. It might have worked, if not for the fact that, during the press conference, someone played the audio of Karen's "pity swim" comment on a speaker from a nearby porch. Todd's face fell mid-sentence. The entire room groaned. Reporters started packing up their cameras before he finished. Meanwhile, Lena was thriving in the most unexpected way. She'd been invited to speak at 2 advocacy events and had been featured in an editorial about everyday heroes. Strangers sent her letters, flowers, and even handmade cards from kids learning about disability rights in school. At first, she tried to deflect it all, but eventually she leaned into it, not for the attention, but because she realized she had a voice now, and people were listening. Her story wasn't just a flash in the pan. It had momentum. It had purpose. And through all of this, I was quietly preparing for court. While the HOA flailed in public, I built my case like a skyscraper, one reinforced brick at a time. I compiled every incident, every policy, every email. I had expert witnesses, legal precedent, video footage, and testimony from residents and experts alike. This wasn't just about Lena anymore. This was about accountability. It was about setting a precedent for every HOA, neighborhood, and community that thought they could skirt the law with bureaucracy and get away with it. The final week before court was calm. Not quiet, never that, but calm like the stillness before a storm. The HOA board held no meetings. Karen deactivated her social media. Todd tried to resign but was blocked by a last-minute vote. The community was in limbo, waiting. So was I. Because justice wasn't just coming. It had a date, a docket number, and a courtroom. And when that day arrived, there would be no more speeches, no more lies, and no more hiding behind signs or outdated rules. Just the truth, the law, and a judge who was ready to make some history. The morning of the trial arrived with an air so electric you could feel it in your teeth. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation, reporters lined the sidewalk, and even a few local high school students were there on a field trip, holding signs that read things like "Accessibility is a right" and "Let her swim." Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. There were no empty benches, no idle chatter. Just the quiet shuffle of papers, the occasional clicking of pens, and the weight of what was about to happen. Lena sat beside her attorney, wearing a navy blazer and that quiet determination I'd come to recognize over the years. The same look she had when learning to navigate her first curb in a chair, when she rolled into a job interview that didn't have a ramp, when she was told over and over by strangers that she was so inspiring simply for existing. She wasn't here for pity. She was here for justice. The HOA had brought in a full legal team, 5 attorneys deep, led by someone named Darren who wore cufflinks shaped like gavels and had the smug confidence of a man who thought he was about to destroy a disabled woman in court and look classy doing it. He started strong, painting the HOA as overworked volunteers who were simply trying to maintain safety and order. He argued that Lena was not denied entry to the pool itself but to the pool deck, which, he claimed, was not technically a public accommodation under the law. He pulled out a binder as thick as a brick, filled with regulations, highlighted bylaws, and selectively cited statutes that sounded official enough to impress a jury. Unfortunately for him, there was no jury. Just a federal judge. And that judge knew the law. Every time Darren twisted a statute, misquoted a section, or tried to conflate guidelines with mandates, the judge interrupted. Not harshly, not rudely, but with surgical precision. "That's not what it says," he remarked at one point, flipping open his own copy of the ADA. Darren's mouth moved, but nothing came out. You could almost hear his cufflinks sweating. When it was Lena's turn to speak, the room shifted. Her voice didn't boom. It didn't need to. It was steady. She told them about that day. About rolling to the pool with a cooler and a towel and being told, for the 100th time in 1,000 small ways, that she didn't belong. She explained how she hadn't wanted a fight, just some sunshine and her feet in the water. She talked about growing up believing the law was a shield for people like her. That if she played by the rules, the world would meet her halfway. And how that belief cracked a little when someone like Karen decided her presence was a problem. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The silence afterward was enough. I took the floor next, not as Lena's sister but as the legal architect of the case. I walked the court through every violation, every email, every recording. I showed them the outdated rules, the selectively enforced policies, the discriminatory remarks. I reminded them that the ADA wasn't a suggestion, it was a civil right, and that allowing one woman to weaponize policy against people with disabilities didn't just inconvenience them, it excluded them. I brought up the federal grant the HOA had accepted, and how it came with clear requirements for accessibility, all of which had been ignored. I laid it out plainly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a systemic failure wrapped in fake professionalism and neighborhood niceties. The defense tried one last stunt, claiming the HOA had already apologized, revised the rules, and even offered to compensate Lena. They said dragging this into court was unnecessary. The judge paused, leaned back in his chair, and asked, would they have revised anything if they hadn't been sued? The question hung in the air. Darren shifted uncomfortably. The judge nodded once. That was all he needed. After closing statements, the judge took a recess. The entire courtroom exhaled. Lena looked at me, brow furrowed. Do you think it's enough? She asked. I squeezed her hand. It was never about enough, I said. It's about what's right. 20 minutes later, we got our answer. The judge returned, solemn but firm. He ruled in our favor. Declared the HOA in violation of multiple federal statutes. Ordered immediate policy overhaul, mandated ADA compliance audits, imposed the maximum allowable fine, and, just for good measure, required public notification of the ruling to all HOA communities in the region. It wasn't just a win. It was a reckoning. Karen resigned the next morning. This time it stuck. She released a statement filled with all the usual empty phrases. Lessons learned, moving forward, personal growth. No one believed it. Her resignation was followed quickly by Todd's. Turns out, the board had been under fire for more than just this case. Residents were furious about years of unreported fines, mismanaged funds, and general pettiness. With the power vacuum in place, the community voted in a new board within the month. Lena was nominated. She didn't want the position at first. I didn't come here to be in charge, she told me. I just wanted to sit by the pool. But the community insisted. They wanted someone with integrity, someone who'd stood up when it mattered. So she accepted. Her swearing-in ceremony was quiet but symbolic. It took place right at the edge of the pool. The pool itself got a facelift. Not just ramps and railings, but new signage, shade structures, and even a redesigned layout that made accessibility natural instead of an afterthought. It stopped being a place guarded by outdated rules and started becoming what it was meant to be, a place for everyone. The day it reopened, there was a community party. Kids splashed, music played, and Lena rolled up in a brand new all-terrain wheelchair donated by a local nonprofit. She dipped her wheels into the water, turned to me, and smiled. Think they'll mind if I do a cannonball next year? She joked. I laughed. Only if you beat them to it. As for me, I went back to work, back to the courtroom, back to the quiet satisfaction of fighting battles most people never see. But this one stuck with me. Not just because it was personal, but because it proved something I'd always believed deep down. That justice isn't loud. It doesn't always come with headlines or applause. Sometimes it looks like a pool chair. Sometimes it sounds like a gate opening. Sometimes it feels like sun on your face and water at your feet. And sometimes it's just the quiet knowledge that you made space where someone once said there was none. Because in the end, that's what it's all about. Not punishment, not pride, not even the law. Just making sure no one gets left out because of who they are or what they sit in. And making damn sure that the next time someone rolls up to the gate, the only thing they're told is, welcome.